Mormon Primeval, a conspiracy theory. It's interesting for me to watch the fallout from the recent TV series American Primeval, which depicts the infamous Mountain Meadows Massacre and Brigham Young's possible involvement. I'm entertained by the back and forth between church apologists and church antagonists and their different interpretations of the whole sad story. I kind of have my own ideas on this issue, and today I want to talk about the massacre. But I also want to talk about another similar event, something that happened around the same time in Brigham Young's Mormon empire that I think might be related. It's something I stumbled across a year or so ago, and when American Primeval was released, it reminded me to go back and investigate. If you're interested, get ready to pull down your blinds and to put on your tinfoil hats, and let's see if this conspiracy theory has any truth to it. But to start off, I want to look at the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the statement the LDS Church released regarding American Primeval. They said, quote, "This drama is dangerously misleading. Brigham Young, a revered prophet and courageous pioneer, is, by any historical standard, egregiously mischaracterized as a villainous, violent fanatic. The Savior's message is clear. True disciples of Jesus Christ are peacemakers. It is the prophetic message of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a message of peace that all modern prophets have shared, including Brigham Young." Unquote. This is an interesting statement for the leaders of the church to make. It highlights a long-standing question among Mormons and non-Mormons alike. Was Brigham Young a peace-loving disciple of Jesus Christ, as the LDS Church now claims? Or was he a man capable of orchestrating, among other things, murder? And even beyond that question, it raises a much larger question for me personally. Are the modern protégés of Brigham Young, the top LDS leaders currently enthroned in Salt Lake, likewise simply peace-loving disciples of Christ and, quote, revered prophets? Or is there a possibility that along with Brigham Young, off the stage and out of the limelight, they might actually be deceitful, arrogant, avaricious, and even sometimes dangerous? These are important questions to me. I grew up in the LDS Church that revered the top 15 leaders to the point of almost worshiping them. We framed pictures of them in our homes and churches. We sang songs praising them, and we hung on to their every words every 6 months at General Conference. These leaders, including President Hinckley, the hero of my youth, always seemed perfectly dressed, in perfectly good humor, with the perfect words to say in every situation. It wasn't until later that I learned that their perfect outward appearances are largely a facade. Like when I found out that Hinckley was the one to first okay the top-secret multi-billion-dollar shell companies that hid away the tithing of poor members like me. Later, too, I learned about other troubling things that my LDS heroes did. Polygamy was a big one. I had a hard time coming to grips with that. And the fact that my heroes had, for some reason, not allowed black members to get sealed as families in the temple for over 100 years. And that they had required members for generations, including my ancestors, to mimic slitting their own throats in the secret temple endowment ceremony. Learning that these things really happened and weren't, as I was previously told, just anti-Mormon lies, made me wonder if these top men of the LDS Church really were the good, righteous apostles of Jesus that they claimed to be. If they were, why would they do all of these things? And if they weren't, then why did they claim to be just Jesus' representatives on earth today? As of now, I believe for certain that they are not Jesus' chosen disciples. So then, if they're not, what does that make them? Are they simply well-intentioned but deceived old men who actually believe they talk to Christ every day? Or are they cunning and calculating men who are carrying on a great deception, knowing that what they are doing is a lie, and yet continuing to keep up the facade in order to maintain their money, their power, and their status? And this conundrum, that either the LDS leaders are true prophets of Christ or else they are charlatans capable of deceit and maybe even harm, brings me back to Brigham Young, American Primeval, and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The Mountain Meadows Massacre remains, to this day, one of the largest mass murders ever committed on American soil. It occurred in 1857 in a remote valley in the very southwestern tip of Utah, when 120 unarmed men, women, and children of the Baker Fancher wagon train were lured out of their wagon circle by a militia of Mormons under a white flag of peace, and then gunned down in cold blood by them and their Native American allies. In the year 1858, a year after the massacre, Brigham Young sent a report to the Commission of Indian Affairs stating that the murder was the work of Native Americans. It wasn't until 14 years later, in 1872, that media outside of Utah finally learned about the murders, and it wasn't until 16 years later, in 1874, that the first arrest was finally made in connection with the massacre. 16 years. In the end, only one person out of the 100 or so Mormons involved in the massacre, John D. Lee, was found guilty of involvement, and he was quickly executed. About 100 other Mormons who were involved escaped prosecution, leading many people to claim that John D. Lee was served up to the government by the church as a scapegoat in order to make the issue go quietly away. Since that time, the church has remained eerily silent on the Mormon involvement in the massacre. In fact, the LDS Church didn't officially recognize its members' responsibility for the attack for over 150 years, through at least 2002. But now, the church has a problem. A skeleton they thought they had successfully hidden in the closet has come out on Netflix and is being seen for the first time by millions of people. And while this historical examination infuriates the church, the rest of us want answers. And most importantly, who was responsible for this atrocity? As I noted, Brigham Young and the church originally tried to blame Native Americans, but that narrative was proven false. Since then, church leaders and historians have tried to place the blame on a few frenzied local members, claiming that they took it upon themselves to deliberately orchestrate the mass murder and then cover it up, all without the knowledge or blessing of Brigham Young. While this theory is possible, and it might be true, I see two very serious issues with it. Number one, I don't think the Mountain Meadows Massacre was carried out by a random group of disgruntled pioneers because people normally don't just go around committing cold, dispassionate mass murder. There's a reason why this was the largest mass murder in America up till the Oklahoma bombings, because people generally have consciences. As I look around me in my neighborhood and city, I see people who sometimes disagree on things, and they might even get angry. But I don't know anyone who would ever decide one day to get together with the rest of our neighbors and go out and plan a mass murder. Sure, Hitler was able to do it. So was Stalin. And so was Mao. Between them, they orchestrated the murders of millions. But they all had one thing in common, which was my next point: hierarchy. And so number two is, I don't think the Mountain Meadows Massacre was carried out by a random group of disgruntled pioneers, because anyone who knows anything about Mormon culture knows you can't do anything without direction and permission from leaders above you. Whether you want to have an overnight campout, or to invite a guest speaker to a fireside, or even stand up to sing it during a hymn in the presence of an apostle, nothing is ever done without someone above you giving you the okay. And so to even begin to imagine that 100 pioneer Mormons randomly gathered up weapons and food, traveled to Mountain Meadows, laid siege to a wagon train for 2 or 3 days, lured the travelers out of their defenses under a flag of peace, and then in unison coldly turned and murdered them all, men, women, and children. To imagine all this happened without the permission or direction from their higher-ups, for me, that's impossible. Absolutely impossible. So then, what is possible? Well, John D. Lee, the only man scapegoated and executed for the massacre, wrote exactly what was possible. In the days leading up to his execution, he dictated the entire event to his attorney, who then published it on Lee's behalf. I've read that book. Regarding the murders, Lee's history says that Brigham Young sent one of his most trusted aides directly from Salt Lake to tell Lee, who was a quasi-adopted son of Brigham's, and other leaders in the area, that they were under orders to wipe out a certain wagon train that was going to come through the area, and they were ordered to either convince the Indians to do it, or else to do it themselves and make it look like Indians. Therefore, under Salt Lake's direction, the area priesthood leaders called up and organized the Mormon men and led them out to battle. At first, the Mormons did try to convince the Indians to do Brigham Young's dirty work for him, but when it looked like they weren't excited about doing it alone, the Mormons stepped in and ultimately carried out the brutality with the Indians' help. And so, much like average German citizens who were compelled by Hitler to murder Jews, something they never would have done on their own, likewise, a bunch of unfortunate but obedient Mormons kept their temple covenants to obey their leaders and committed mass murder of their fellow men. They then continued to keep their covenants by entering into a promise to keep the murder secret and to help Brigham Young to blame it on the Indians. As I have come to understand more of the true nature of Brigham Young, From his teachings on blood atonement and slavery, to his treatment of women, to his probable involvement in the murder of Joseph Smith and subsequent heavy-handed takeover of the LDS Church, to his extermination order that resulted in the extinction of the Timpanogos Native American Indian tribe, as I've come to read and understand all these things, I've realized that Brigham and some of his successors really are capable of any level of deception and depravity necessary to retain their power. So that leads me to my conspiracy theory. Was there possibly more than one Mountain Meadows Massacre? Around the same time that I was learning about the things like who killed Joseph Smith and reading first-hand accounts of polygamy and oppression in Utah, I was at our local library one day, and I happened to go down the aisle that contained books about Native Americans. A book on the shelf caught my eye because of its unique title, The Inconvenient Indian, and so I picked it up and I started reading. I was immediately captivated by the Native American author Thomas King's writing style, and so I sat down and read. And something I read set off alarm bells in my mind. It was King's story of the town of Almo, Idaho. Almo, Idaho is a map dot of a town, right on the Utah-Idaho border. It was first settled by Mormons in the 1800s, and in many respects it was just like countless other tiny Mormon pioneer communities. But it has one distinction that sets it apart. It has a granite monument in the middle of town dedicated to the memory of a wagon train massacred that happened there in 1861. The monument reads, Almo, Idaho, dedicated to the memory of those who lost their lives in a most horrible Indian massacre, 1861. 300 immigrants westbound, only 5 escaped, erected by the Sons and Daughters of the Idaho Pioneers, 1938. The story of that massacre was first published in the book 6 Decades Back, written by author Charles Walgamot and printed in 1936. I found a copy of the book, and here are some of the excerpts of the story he tells. He tells of a, quote, well-organized, well-armed and provisioned, and well-equipped company, drawing more than 60 wagons. The company was followed until its rear wagon was some distance from Almo Creek. Suddenly, a prearranged signal was given by an Indian lookout, and Indians in great numbers emerged and surrounded the surprised immigrants, who immediately gave orders for all wagons to be corralled. The Indians had the immigrant train cut off from the water, and the siege began. It continued until the immigrants had exhausted their ammunition and were famished for water. The digging of a well was started in hopes of getting water, but it proved disappointing. Approximately 4 days later, the entire party was slain, and the wagons burned. The bodies of the unfortunate people were buried in the wells which they had dug. Unquote. Author Charles Walgamot visited the battleground in 1875. He said, evidence of the conflict was marked plainly by trenches thrown up under each wagon as they were arranged in circles. The only records rest in the memory of old people who lived at the time, or in the account as handed down from parent to child. The best informer was Mr. W.M.E. Johnston. In 1872, Mr. Johnston visited the battlefield, and in 1887, the Johnston family moved to Almo Creek, securing the land that partially covered the battlefield, which still bore evidence of the hard-fought battle. In leveling and plowing the ground for alfalfa, Mr. Johnson uncovered numerous old guns and pistols. Unquote. But there are a few problems with this history. Some people, including LDS historian Brigham Madsen, as well as his protege and Native American historian Thomas King, the author I mentioned earlier, argue that the massacre never took place. Why would they say such a thing? Well, number one, in King's research, he believes there were not enough Native Americans in the area at the time to successfully have besieged and killed a wagon train of that size. To him, the numbers just didn't add up, based on the size and locations of the various tribes at that time. Number two, in Madsen's research, he's unable to find any mention of the massacre in any of the local newspapers of the time, such as the nearest paper, which was LDS-controlled Deseret News of Salt Lake. Number three, Madsen also observes that there is no record that the massacre came to the attention of the Indian Service Agents or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And number four, finally, no record has been found of anyone claiming to have missed the wagon train when it did not arrive at its supposed destination in the Oregon Territory. So maybe Madsen and King are correct, and the event never occurred. It could have all just been a made-up story, and that's a possible theory. But if that's the case, why would the citizens of a town, in conjunction with the organization the Sons and Daughters of Idaho Pioneers, go to the trouble and expense to erect such a detailed and unusual monument? and continue to defend its validity in the face of outside criticism and pressure? And why would stories be told and even a book written about the event? Maybe, just maybe, this monument and these stories are echoes of something that did happen, that was covered up, but that weighed on the minds and hearts of local Mormons to the point that they felt compelled to tell the story, even if the story they told was flawed and incomplete. So that brings me to my story. Here's my conspiracy theory. I propose that there was a wagon train. Perhaps a big one as described by Walgamott's book, or perhaps a smaller one. The wagon train was moving out of Utah and going to Oregon. It had just crossed the Utah-Idaho border, and I believe was probably filled with disaffected Mormons trying to escape Brigham's grasp. Remember, this happened in the spring of 1861, only 4 years after the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Brigham Young had just finished the infamous Mormon Reformation a couple years before, with its intense preachings on blood atonement, polygamy, and complete obedience to church leaders. Many converts and immigrants to Utah were appalled at the authoritarian kingdom they found themselves in when they arrived, and many tried to escape, and some were killed. In the midst of Brigham's dictatorial crackdowns, perhaps a group of disaffected converts and immigrants decided to make a break for Oregon Territory. Brigham, known for his narcissism and ruthlessness, upon finding out about their desertion, would have been enraged. I believe he sent orders to have this wagon train massacred, just as he had done with the Mountain Meadows Massacre 4 years before. But this time, it would be a cleaner job. He had learned his lesson. There would be no messy investigations. So to do that, first, the people he sent would leave no trace of the bodies. One of the downfalls of the Mountain Meadows Massacre is the bodies were left out in the open and later found by non-Mormon U.S. military personnel, who raised the alarm and caused the need for an investigation. Otherwise, the Mormons would have gotten away with it scot-free. And so Brigham ordered the Almo bodies to be cast into a well, the well buried, and the wagons burned. Second, they needed to do a better job of keeping a secret. Unlike with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Brigham decided not to report the massacre to the Bureau of Indian Affairs so that they wouldn't come snooping around and asking too many questions. And finally, Brigham knew that if he kept the Deseret News and other papers from printing anything about the story, no one would ever know what had happened. The victims would already have been lost to their friends and families back in Europe when they joined the Mormons anyway. No one would wonder exactly where they were out west or what became of them, and they wouldn't be missed. What I think Brigham didn't count on was the guilt that lived in the hearts of some of the people who were involved. And some of them, or those who knew about the massacre, told stories to their children and their grandchildren. Stories not quite true, because that would break their blood oaths and covenants they made in the temple, never to divulge the secrets of the church. But stories that came close, stories that allowed the dead to be remembered in some way. Hence the tale that the massacre was committed by Indians, just like with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And that is why the Almo Monument was erected and is defended from critics to this day. Like I said, it's a conspiracy theory. I have no evidence except for a granite monument, a book, and a pattern of authoritarianism and murder from the leaders of the Utah LDS Church. Maybe it's all hogwash. Or maybe it's true. What do you think? I'll end with the haunting words of the Lord to us, the Gentiles. In Ether 8, he says, O ye Gentiles, the Lord commandeth you, when ye shall see these things come among you, that ye shall awake to a sense of your awful situation because of this secret combination which shall be among you. Or woe be unto it, because of the blood of them who have been slain, for they cry from the dust for vengeance upon it, and also upon those who built it up.